I found out he'd been rehearsing how I would fall apart, the exact words I'd say, the exact moment the tears would start, while his sister took notes and his coworker timed the whole thing on her phone. He was so certain he had me mapped out, down to the trembling lip and the desperate plea not to leave. He talked through every version of my breaking. I sat in my car in our own driveway and listened to all of it through a window left 2 inches open. Then I drove away, called my lawyer, and started building something he never saw coming. I was not supposed to be home that Thursday afternoon. The consultation I'd scheduled in Whistler had been pushed back 3 weeks. A last-minute message from the client about delayed permits, and rather than stay in the mountains and rebook a hotel, I drove the sea to sky back toward Vancouver, while the October light turned the water that particular shade of gray I'd always loved. I was thinking about tile samples. I was thinking about whether the Kerrisdale project could close before Christmas. I was not thinking about my husband at all, which probably says something I wasn't ready to say out loud yet. Our house in East Vancouver had that particular Tuesday afternoon quiet when I pulled into the alley behind it. My husband's Audi was in the lane, which surprised me. He'd said depositions all day. I didn't think much of it. I came in through the back, through the mudroom where we kept our bikes and his old hockey gear, and I heard his voice before I reached the kitchen. He was in the living room. The sliding door to the back garden was open a few centimeters, the way he always left it when he wanted fresh air, and his voice carried clearly through that gap into the kitchen, where I stood absolutely still with my bag sliding off my shoulder. "She's going to say I owe her for articling," my husband was saying. "That's her first move. She'll bring up the money, the apartment, how she freelanced extra projects so I could study for the bar." A woman's voice, not one I recognized immediately as warm, but one I recognized, said something I couldn't quite catch. "Let her," he said. "That's the point. Once she starts crying about money, she's already lost the high ground. I've talked to someone at the firm. In BC, without a cohabitation agreement covering the business, she'd have a claim, but if she's emotional in mediation, any reasonable arbiter is going to see her as the difficult one." I pressed my back against the wall beside the refrigerator. The kitchen tiles were cold through my jacket. I recognized the second voice now. It was my sister-in-law, my husband's younger sister, who had been a bridesmaid at our wedding 6 years ago and who sent me birthday cards every October without fail, cards I had kept in the drawer of my studio desk because I thought they meant something. "What about her clients?" she asked. "Some of them are through the joint account." "That's the other thing," my husband said. "Diane's already been introduced to 3 of them as my business associate. By the time Nadia realizes what's happened, the invoicing structure will already have shifted. The numbered company handles it cleanly. Diane." I turned that name over very carefully in my mind, the way you turn something sharp over to see where the edge is. Diane Marchetti. She was a junior associate at the same firm where my husband had made partner 18 months ago. I had met her at a firm dinner in the spring. She had complimented my earrings and asked where I'd found them. "She won't fight it," my husband continued, his voice taking on a certainty that was almost gentle, as if he were explaining something to a child. "Nadia avoids confrontation. Always has. She'd rather lose cleanly than fight messily. That's just who she is. She'll be devastated, she'll take some time, and then she'll move on." "You sound very confident," his sister said. And there was something in her voice I couldn't quite read, not entirely comfortable but not resistant either. "Because I know her," he said. "Better than she knows herself at this point." I picked up my bag from where it had dropped to the floor. I walked back through the mudroom. I got into my car, reversed out of the lane, and drove 4 blocks before I pulled over on a residential street where the maple trees were starting to go orange, and I sat there with my hands in my lap for a while. I want to tell you that I cried. I didn't. What happened was something stranger, a very complete stillness, the way a room goes quiet when all the sound is suddenly evacuated from it. I had been married for 6 years. I had covered the rent in a 1-bedroom in Kitsilano while my husband articled at $42,000 a year. I had taken on 4 extra residential projects in a single year, working weekends and evenings, so we could save enough for the down payment on the East Van house. I had believed, with the kind of belief that sits below conscious thought, that we were building something together. He had apparently been building something else entirely. My phone was in my hand before I had made any deliberate decision. I scrolled to a number I hadn't called in over a year. Patricia Osei, a family lawyer who had done a consultation for my friend when her marriage ended, who had the reputation of being exactly as careful as she was formidable. "Patricia," I said when she answered. "It's Nadia Whitmore." I need to understand exactly where I stand. And I need to do it before my husband knows I've started asking. Her office was on West Broadway, spare and organized in a way that made me feel immediately calmer. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting, and when I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me with an expression that was not pity but something more useful: focus. In British Columbia, she said, the Family Law Act treats family property as presumptively equal. What complicates your situation is the business. My interior design studio, Whitmore Studio, had been incorporated 3 years into our marriage with $70,000 from a joint RRSP withdrawal and a further $40,000 from my own savings. Pre-marriage savings I had documentation for, from my years freelancing before I'd met my husband. The premarital contribution matters, Patricia said. But what matters more right now is this numbered company. If he's been routing client payments through a separate entity without your knowledge, and invoicing clients of your joint business, that moves out of family law territory into something considerably more serious. How serious? Fraud adjacent, she said simply. We need records. I went home that night and made dinner and asked my husband how the depositions had gone. He said tiring. He said long. He kissed my cheek when I handed him a glass of wine, and I watched his face with a detachment that surprised me, the way you look at a painting you've walked past 100 times and suddenly see it clearly for the first time, brushstroke by brushstroke. Everything okay? He asked, studying me. Just tired from the drive, I said. Whistler traffic. He nodded and went back to his phone. That was a Friday. By the following Wednesday I had pulled every invoice, every contract, every client communication from the studio server onto an encrypted drive that I kept in my studio's lockbox. I cross-referenced them against our joint business account, the one tied to the studio's GST registration, and I found what I was looking for in the third month I audited. A pattern of invoices to 3 of our longest-standing residential clients that did not route through Whitmore Studios' HST number, but through a separate numbered Ontario corporation with a registered address that was a postal outlet in Mississauga. Patricia's financial investigator put a name to the director within 4 days: Diane Marchetti, sole director. My husband, a silent beneficial owner. Over $62,000 had been quietly redirected over 14 months. Not enormous in the context of some corporate frauds, but enough to matter legally, enough to matter in the context of what it revealed about intent, about planning, about how long this had actually been in motion before my husband stood in our living room rehearsing the version of me who would sob and accept a settlement. I want to tell you that I was angry. I was, somewhere deep and useful, but mostly what I felt during those 2 weeks was a clarity so sharp it almost had a physical sensation, like very cold water. I thought about my father, who had immigrated from Trinidad with $40 and a trade certification and had built a plumbing company in Brampton through 30 years of stubborn, methodical work. He had a phrase he repeated so often it stopped registering until I needed it. Understand the whole job before you pick up the first tool. I was beginning to understand the whole job. My husband presented me with an opportunity I hadn't anticipated on a Thursday morning, the same day of the week as when I'd overheard him, which felt like something. He was preparing submissions for a client, and asked me to sign off on several documents he'd printed, relating to a commercial lease negotiation where Whitmore Studio was listed as a reference entity. He spread them across the kitchen island, already highlighted where my signature was needed. Standard stuff, he said, reaching for his coffee, half watching a report on CBC, just confirming our studio's good standing. I looked at the pages. They were not entirely what he'd described. Tucked between the lease reference documents were 2 additional pages, an assignment of client relationship rights for 3 named accounts, the same 3 accounts I'd identified as having been diverted, and an authorization of studio intellectual property usage by a numbered corporation, left blank in the field where the corporation's number would appear. He had not expected me to actually read them. That had been his miscalculation from the beginning. He thought he knew exactly what I would and wouldn't do. I signed the lease reference documents only. I set the pen down on the other 2 pages and said, mildly, these 2 aren't related to the lease, are they? He looked up. Something passed across his face quickly. Just consolidating some admin, he said. I'll look at them more carefully tonight, I said. I have a client call in 20 minutes. He picked them up without another word, and I watched him fold them back into his briefcase, and I understood something very precisely in that moment. He was further along in his planning than I had realized. He had needed those signatures to clean up the paper trail before he initiated the separation. Without them, the diversion was traceable and exposed. Without them, I had everything I needed. That evening, I called Patricia again and told her what had happened. "He's going to move soon," she said. "We need to decide on your timeline." "There's an industry event next month," I said. "The BC Interior Design Awards. We're both expected. 2 of the diverted clients will be there. They've been shortlisted on a project I led. There'll be people whose opinion matters to both of us professionally." A brief pause. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. I told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "It would need to be documented carefully. And you'd need to be absolutely composed." "I know, Nadia." Her voice shifted into something more direct. "Are you sure you want to do it this way? You have enough to proceed through lawyers alone." "He practiced how I would fall apart," I said. "I want him to understand that he was wrong about me, not just legally. Actually wrong about who I am." Another pause. "Then let's make sure you're prepared." The weeks between that conversation and the awards evening were the strangest of my life. I dressed for work each morning and sat across from my husband at breakfast and discussed renovation timelines and what we needed from the grocery store and whether his mother was coming for Christmas. I was, functionally, 2 people: the woman he believed he still had mapped out, and the woman who was quietly, methodically building something he would not see until she was ready. He had one more planning session with his sister. I know because she called the house line by accident. She'd meant to call his mobile, and when I picked up and said hello, there was a 2-second silence before she said she'd try his cell. I heard him take the call in his office with the door closed, and I heard almost nothing except the soft rhythm of his voice, the particular cadence of a man going over a plan he was confident in. I felt something then, not quite grief, not quite anger. Something more like the feeling of looking at a photograph of a place you loved before you understood what it actually was. The marriage I thought I'd had existed somewhere. I was certain. I had loved him. That part was real. But the architecture underneath it, the calculations I'd never been shown that had apparently been there from very close to the beginning, and I was only now seeing the actual blueprints. My studio's accountant helped me with the formal documentation of the diverted invoices. My own lawyer at the Law Society helpline confirmed what I suspected. A lawyer in BC who participated in fraudulent redirection of business revenues, even through a third party, had significant professional exposure. The Law Society of British Columbia took conduct matters seriously. A formal complaint, if substantiated, could affect a lawyer's standing, potentially their license. I wasn't certain I would file one. I was certain he needed to know it existed as a possibility. The BC Interior Design Awards were held at the Fairmont waterfront on a Thursday evening in late November, the kind of Vancouver night where the rain held off and the North Shore mountains sat in the dark like a rumor. I arrived before my husband, having told him I needed to check in with one of the shortlisted clients beforehand. I found the 2 clients, the HCA family from West Vancouver, and David Carmichael, a commercial developer who had been with my studio since its 3rd year, and I spoke with them briefly. Honestly enough to prepare them without alarming them. Only that there was a business matter I'd be addressing this evening and I wanted them to have context. David, who had built 3 towers in Burnaby and had seen more than his share of corporate maneuvers, simply nodded and said, "Tell me what you need me to do." "Stay in the room," I said. "That's all." My husband arrived at 7:15 in the navy suit he wore to important things. He moved through the room with that ease he had always had in professional settings. The ease of someone who had spent years learning to look like he belonged everywhere. He found me near the bar, kissed my cheek, accepted a glass of wine from a passing server. "You look incredible," he said, and I believed he meant it, which was perhaps the strangest part of the whole evening. The dinner was served in the main ballroom, round tables for 8, and I had arranged our seating so that we were with the HES, with David Carmichael, with our studio's project manager, a woman named Grace, who had been with me for 4 years and who deserved to know the truth, and with 2 industry colleagues I trusted. My husband noted the arrangement without comment, though I saw the slight recalibration behind his eyes. The awards happened first, efficiently, and Whitmore Studio placed second in the residential category on the HCAIHEAHE project. There was applause and a small trophy and a photograph. My husband stood beside me for it and smiled. And in that moment I thought about all the things that had been real, all the years that had genuinely happened, and I felt the grief of it move through me and then settle, the way it needed to settle before I could do what I had to do. Dessert was being set on the tables when my husband turned to me, the way I knew he would. He had picked the moment carefully, public enough to prevent a scene, witnesses enough to frame me as the emotional one if necessary, the award just given so there was a veneer of celebration to layer over what he was about to do. "Nadia," he said, and his voice had that quality I now recognized, the practiced warmth, the gentle preloading of inevitability. "There's something I've been needing to talk to you about. I've been putting it off because I know it's hard to hear." David Carmichael, across the table, set down his fork. Grace looked up. The HCS exchanged a brief glance. My husband continued as if we were the only people in the room, which was the point. He wanted an audience for my reaction, not for his performance. "I think we both know things have shifted between us. I've changed, you've changed. I don't think we want the same things anymore. And I don't want to waste any more of your time. Or mine," I said quietly. He paused. "Recovered. That's what I mean. We're practical people. A clean separation, mediation, we've both got careers. You might want to finish reading this before you continue," I said, and I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and withdrew the folder Patricia had prepared, not the manila of bureaucracy but clean cream cardstock, my studio's letterhead on the outside, and I placed it on the tablecloth between us. He looked at it. He looked at me. "What is this?" "A complete accounting," I said, at a volume the table could hear clearly, of $62,000 in studio revenue redirected through a numbered Ontario corporation to accounts controlled by you and Diane Marchetti over the last 14 months, with the corresponding HST registration discrepancy, which the CRA will find relevant, and a summary of the Law Society of BC conduct provisions that apply to a lawyer who participates in the fraudulent diversion of a co-owner's business revenue. The color left his face in a way that was almost mechanical. He reached for the folder with the instinct of someone trying to remove a document from the sight of witnesses. David Carmichael's hand, calmly and without drama, was already resting on the edge of the table in a way that made the gesture impossible without making a scene. "I've seen those invoices," David said, his voice level. 3 of mine ran through an account I didn't recognize. I thought it was a billing error. Grace, beside me, said nothing. Her expression said everything. "This is," my husband started, then stopped. The practiced gentleness had left his voice entirely. "This is a completely distorted version of the 14 months you were planning to leave me," I said. "I know about the rehearsal. I know your sister helped you draft the version of this conversation where I would cry and agree to mediation before I understood what had actually been taken." I looked at him steadily. "She called the house line by mistake 3 weeks ago." Something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. Not anger. Not calculation. Something stripped down and raw, the expression of a man who had built an entire structure on a foundation he believed was solid, and who can feel it shifting. "Nadia, I'm not finished," I said, calmly. "The studio's intellectual property, the client list, the design portfolio, the trade contacts I built over 9 years, those remain with the studio, which I will be assuming sole operational control of effective the 1st of December. Patricia Osai's office has filed the necessary documentation with the BC Registry. You'll receive your copy Monday." One of my industry colleagues, a woman named Sandra who ran a competing architecture firm and who had been at our wedding, looked at my husband with an expression of such quiet professional disappointment that I think it hit him harder than anything else at the table. "The fraud matter," I continued. "I have not yet decided whether to refer formally. That will depend on how the next conversation between our lawyers goes." I picked up my wine glass. "You did say you wanted to be practical." He sat very still. The table had gone quiet in that particular way of people who are witnessing something they will think about for a long time. "I thought I knew exactly what you'd do," he said. His voice had gone flat, all the performance dissolved out of it. "I know," I said. "That was the part you got most wrong." He left the table before dessert was served. I watched him go with a feeling that was not triumph and not grief exactly, but something that occupied the same space as both of them. Something that felt, more than anything, like standing in a room with all the windows finally open. David Carmichael touched the back of my hand briefly and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. Sandra poured me more wine. Grace, beside me, said quietly, "I had no idea." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." "Don't apologize," she said. "What do you need from me?" "Monday morning," I said. "New client intake process. We're rebuilding the invoicing structure cleanly, and I want you running point on it." She nodded once, And that was that. The next weeks were not easy. I want to be honest about that. The lawyers communicated for 6 weeks before anything was finalized, and there were mornings in the house in East Vancouver which I stayed in, which we agreed on, which he signed over as part of the settlement, when the silence felt enormous and strange, when I reached for a habit of 10 years and found the space where it used to live instead. Grief does not care that you were right. It operates on its own schedule entirely. But there were other things too. The Law Society received a formal complaint in December, filed by Patricia's office. I don't know yet what will come of it. These processes are not fast, but it was filed, and my husband knows it was filed, and his partners at the firm know it was filed, and that knowledge has a weight I had not fully anticipated. The numbered corporation was dissolved. The CRA matter is ongoing. The studio's first quarter under my sole operational control closed at 17% above projection. We brought on 2 new associates, one from a firm in Calgary who had been looking to move west, one who had graduated from Langara's design program in the spring and whom I'd had my eye on for a year. We submitted for the national awards in the spring. We won one. I moved my father's photograph from the storage unit where it had been sitting since we left the Kitsilano apartment, back when there wasn't wall space in our new house and I'd never got around to finding a place for it. I hung it in my studio office, behind my desk. He is about 40 in the photograph, standing in front of a plumbing van in a Brampton winter, wearing a jacket clearly insufficient for the temperature and grinning at whoever is behind the camera. He always looked like someone who knew exactly what he was building and trusted the work entirely. Understand the whole job before you pick up the first tool. I understand it now. My sister-in-law reached out in January. A message, not a call she knew I had every right not to answer. She said she was sorry. She said she hadn't known the full extent of what was being planned, only that the relationship had been going on for over a year. Only that she'd been asked to help prepare for the conversation. She said she should have refused. She said she missed me. I read it twice and put the phone down and sat with it for a few days. And then I wrote back, not warmly, not yet, but honestly, which is where everything has to start. My husband, from what I understand through the lawyers and through the particular osmosis of a professional community that is smaller than it seems, is still at the firm. Diane Marchetti transferred to a Toronto office. I don't know whether that is relevant. I have found, surprisingly, that I don't think about him as often as I would have predicted. What I think about, instead, is the drive back from Whistler on that October afternoon, the grey water of Howe Sound, the particular quality of the light. I was thinking about tile samples. I was thinking about a project deadline. I was not thinking about any of the things that were actually about to change my life. I think about the woman who sat in her car 4 blocks from her own house and felt that enormous stillness, and I think about what she decided to do with it. Not to scream. Not to beg. Not to perform the version of herself that had been scripted for her by a man who believed, down to the rehearsed specifics, that he knew exactly who she was. She picked up her phone. She called a lawyer. She started building. If you've ever had someone tell you, with complete certainty, that they knew exactly how you would react, exactly how you would break, then you know the particular power of proving them wrong. Not with noise, with work, with patience and documentation and the willingness to understand the whole job before you pick up the first tool. That's what my father taught me. It turns out it applies to more than plumbing. If this resonated with you, subscribe, it's free, and it means you'll be here for the next one. And leave me a comment. Tell me about a time someone underestimated what you were capable of. I read every one. I'll see you next time.